We know after the Civil War that America went through this massive industrialization. Does that mean America totally gave up on agriculture? Of course not. So what was going on with farmers during this industrialization? That's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom.
Our essential question for this section is, how did farmers in the West help to shape the politics of America? Really, it all goes back to this guy right here. His name is Oliver Hudson Kelley. He started a group called the Patrons of Husbandry way back in 1867. Essentially, this is a group that got together and complained about how the government wasn't really doing anything to help farmers. As they complained, the group got bigger and bigger. Eventually, they changed their name. They called themselves the Grange. This was the first truly political farmers organization, and they actually got a lot of stuff accomplished. As the Grange gained more and more power, people followed their example. As the Grange gained more and more power and was able to get more things done for farmers, other farmers started to follow the example, and you started to see the development of what were called farmers' alliances all across the country. By the end of the 1800s, there were almost 4 million farmers that had banded together in the United States to try to get the government to help them out. Those groups really had some pretty good success. A couple of examples would be the Supreme Court case of Munn versus Illinois in 1871. This dealt with shipping rates. Essentially what that Supreme Court case said was that the states had the right to regulate intrastate railroad commerce. That meant individual states could make up rules for railroads within their states. A little bit later, in 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. And basically what this said was that the federal government had the right to regulate interstate railroad commerce. That meant anything that traveled between states. Under the Interstate Commerce Act, there was a commission called the Interstate Commerce Commission. It had 5 people on it, and they were the ones that set the rules for railroads as far as how much they could charge to ship. Unfortunately, this was part of the government, which meant there was a ton of red tape and nothing really got done very quickly. Another big problem that farmers were facing was money and how much value money had. During the Civil War, the government issued things called greenbacks. This was paper money that you could not take to a bank in exchange for gold or silver. The paper money had value because the government said it had value. After the Civil War, though, the government started issuing what was called hard money, money that could easily be converted to gold or silver. You could take hard money into a certain type of bank and say, I want to change my $5 bill into $5 worth of gold. You couldn't do that with a greenback. Because of this, hard money had more value to it. It was worth more. But what does that mean for farmers? The big problem was that most farmers, especially farmers in the West, had been borrowing greenbacks to be able to buy more land to compete with bonanza farms. As time went on, enter some new economic factors and regulations on money, and all of a sudden farmers start to pay back those loans, but they're paying the loans back with hard money, money that was perceived to have more value. This is where populism starts to come into play. One of the main goals of populism was to increase the money supply, to make sure there was more money for people out there. More money meant you could sell your product for a higher price. It also meant that you could pay back your loan, and you would have enough left over to buy the things that you needed. Real quick, take just a second, pause this video, and copy down this chart. It's all right, I'll wait. Okay, do you have the chart copied down now? Back in the day, America operated on a thing called the gold standard. The gold standard meant that for every dollar the government issued, there was $1 worth of gold floating around somewhere in the United States, usually in some sort of big bank somewhere. Most businessmen liked this idea of the gold standard. The gold standard meant there could only be a definite amount of money floating around. If there's only a definite amount of money, this leads to a thing called deflation. Deflation means prices go down, yet the value of money, how much you could buy with the money that you had, went up. By the way, people who liked the gold standard, they were often called gold bugs. Populists, on the other hand, they believed in a thing called bimetallism. Remember, they wanted to increase the money supply. If you increase the money supply, that meant inflation. Prices went up. The value of money, unfortunately, goes down, but more people get to have money because the money is backed by both gold and silver. By the way, People who believed in bimetallism were often called silverites. This brings up the question, is it better to have less money that's worth more, or is it better to have more money that's worth less? This was the main argument of populists at the end of the 1800s. They said we needed to have more money even if it's going to be worth less, because that means more people get to have it. Well, on the flip side, the Republicans, the big business owners, they stuck to the idea of, well, less money that's worth more is better. That just means we as businessmen get to have all the money. By 1896, populism has gained enough support, they decided to team up with the Democrats and run a joint candidate for the 1896 presidential election. The guy they decided to run is a guy named William Jennings Bryant. Bryant was the perfect candidate because he was incredibly well liked by the Democrats. He was also a bimetalist. He was one of those silverites. During the 1896 Democratic National Convention, that's the thing where parties decide to pick their candidate, Bryant gives this huge speech. It's called the Cross of Gold speech. And this really does catapult him straight to the nomination. Democrats and the populists love this speech. The main point of this speech kind of revolves around this statement: "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Basically what Bryant says in that is that bimetallism is going to be the thing that leads us to prosperity and is going to make the country a better place. Democrats and populists, they totally eat this up. They decide to nominate him as the presidential candidate. Bryant's opponent in the election was a guy named William McKinley. William McKinley was a Republican. He believed in the gold standard, and he had the backing of big business. Essentially what that meant was that he had more money to spend on the election than Bryant did. It also meant that because he had the backing of big business, he kind of also had the vote of all the industrial workers in the big cities back in the East. Unfortunately, McKinley wins the election, and when he does, that kind of signals the demise of populism. Populism just couldn't compete with the money of big business. Fortunately, there were two very powerful legacies that get left behind when populism finally does die. The first one is this idea that the little guy could organize. This is where the idea of unions start to come from. The second idea left behind is the agenda of reform. This kind of becomes the backbone of the Democratic Party. It's the idea that we're going to be able to make the world a better place for everybody involved. Here are a couple of takeaways from this section. The first one is that farmers banded together because they were suffering. The second main takeaway is that farmers, or populists, believed that money was going to be the answer to their problems. The last big takeaway is that populism becomes the basis for the modern Democratic Party.
Alright guys, that's kind of how farmers really helped to shape American politics. Hopefully you got good notes and you'll be ready in case I decide to give you a quiz over this. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, remember that you never need to stop learning.